The surgeon and the fortune teller. That morning, the sun poured across the cafe like it was trying to warm a world that had forgotten how to feel. The old bricks of Fort Worth Coffee Collective, sweating gently under the rising Texas heat. Rachel Turner, dressed in layered earth tones and a shawl that carried the scent of lavender and incense, set up her tarot booth beside the whirring espresso machine like a high priestess among baristas. Her fingers, adorned with silver rings, danced across the weathered deck like they knew stories the world hadn't yet dared to ask for. She wasn't here for the skeptics, and Fort Worth was full of them. No, Rachel had learned to read the space between moments, the tension in shoulders, the slight tremble in fingertips when people said they didn't believe but still paid $20 to see if the cards could touch something they had buried long ago. The regulars showed up for the performance, the drama, the tingle of something ancient in a world obsessed with next-day delivery. But Rachel knew better. Somewhere in every reading, if you listened close enough, the future whispered. It was the sound of her name that made her look up. "I'll take an espresso, the Ethiopian Yirgacheffe if you have it, floral, wet processed, preferably the 2100-meter harvest, but I'll make do." The voice was clinical, clipped, and slightly annoyed. Not because the barista was incompetent, but because the woman behind the voice had been trained to command environments far more chaotic than a coffee shop. Rachel's eyes followed the sound and found her, a woman who seemed out of place, and yet owned every square inch she stepped on. Surgical scrubs under a worn leather jacket, a stethoscope draped like a necklace. A face that looked like it had learned not to show emotion because showing too much could cost a life. She tasted the coffee with the intensity of someone sampling blood for pathogens. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it looked like a dare. But it was her eyes, cold, brilliant, blue like scalpel steel, that stopped Rachel mid-shuffle. "Your future's in the cards," Rachel called out, her voice low and teasing. The woman turned slowly like someone reluctantly acknowledging superstition. Her gaze locked with Rachel's, and for a second it was like heat meeting pressure, something cracked but didn't break. "My future," she said, approaching the table with all the grace of a woman who had no time for nonsense, "is in peer-reviewed journals." Rachel smirked, cardiac surgeon. "Stephanie Perry," the woman replied, extending a hand. "And no, I don't believe in magic." Rachel took the hand and noted the strength in the grip, the smooth pressure. These were hands that had held hearts and restarted them, hands that were used to certainty, hands that didn't shake. "Rachel Turner," she said softly, "and I don't believe in coincidences." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Stephanie leaned closer, eyes narrowing slightly. "Prove it." A dare, a challenge, a thread that could unravel something dangerous or beautiful or both. Rachel laid 3 cards down with a grace born of thousands of readings. The Fool, the Lovers, the World. "New beginnings," she said, tapping the Fool. "A leap of faith." "Cute," Stephanie said, unimpressed. Rachel smiled gently. "The Lovers, a relationship that alters your trajectory, and the World, completion, fulfillment, the kind of wholeness people spend decades trying to find." Stephanie chuckled, but it was tight, like it had been pulled from a place that didn't laugh easily. "Sounds like something you tell everyone." Rachel leaned in, voice dropping. "If you weren't searching for something, doctor, you wouldn't have stopped at my table." Stephanie's smirk faltered for just a second. Then she reached into her jacket, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the table. "Thanks for the entertainment," she said, walking away. Rachel watched her go, but before the woman could reach the door, she spoke again, softer now, but enough for her voice to carry. "Stephanie." The surgeon stopped but didn't turn. "The cards never lie, especially about matters of the heart." The door swung shut behind her, but the air didn't settle. Rachel stared at the lover's card still spread across her velvet cloth, its colors seeming brighter in the morning light. She didn't know why this woman had shaken something loose inside her. All she knew was that this wasn't over. Not even close. The blueberry scones and the battle between logic and longing. 3 days later, Rachel stood outside the sliding glass doors of Fort Worth General Hospital, clutching a white pastry box so tightly the corners of it had begun to cave in slightly, betraying the nerves she had tried so hard to deny. Her flowing floral skirt caught in the breeze, the hem brushing against her sandals as she shifted from one foot to the other. In the box were 6 of the best blueberry scones this side of the Mississippi, her grandmother's recipe, guarded like an heirloom and only used when hearts needed softening, or when Rachel herself needed courage. She told herself this was just a kind gesture, a small thank you for the $20, and a moment of curiosity from a woman who had every reason to never think of her again. But Rachel knew better. The lover's card still echoed in her thoughts every time she closed her eyes, and Stephanie's sharp gaze still lingered in her mind's periphery like a whisper that hadn't yet become a sentence. The hospital cafeteria was a whirl of white coats, scrubs, and exhausted energy. The scent of disinfectant blended with overcooked eggs and burnt coffee. Rachel's eyes scanned the room, and there she was, Stephanie Perry, seated alone at a far corner table, posture upright even in exhaustion, a plastic container of yogurt untouched beside her, a pen in hand and notes spread across the table like a surgeon preparing for another procedure. The bags under her eyes told a story that no stethoscope could diagnose, and yet she still moved with the discipline of someone who had long since accepted that rest was a luxury she wasn't entitled to. Rachel approached the table slowly, unsure if this was brave or foolish. Stephanie looked up when the shadow fell across her notes, and her expression froze in a split second of pure confusion. "Rachel?" she asked, the name escaping her lips like a word she wasn't sure she had permission to speak. Rachel offered the box silently, then placed it on the table with gentle reverence. "Peace offering," Rachel said, sitting across from her without waiting for an invitation. "For the woman who dismissed my entire profession but still paid $20 to hear her future." Stephanie blinked, then cracked the box open. The scent of fresh blueberries and vanilla filled the sterile air. Her expression didn't melt, not yet, but it faltered. "You made these?" "From scratch, family recipe, the kind that's healed everything from heartbreak to hangovers," Rachel said with a soft smile. "And I figured after spending what looks like 20 hours straight saving lives, you could use something sweet." Stephanie didn't reply immediately. Instead, she lifted a scone, broke off a piece, and brought it to her lips. Her eyes closed for just a second too long for a woman who didn't believe in magic. And when they opened again, there was something else behind them. A pause, a hesitation, a thought that hadn't yet found the courage to be voiced. "Triple bypass," Stephanie said after a moment, as if explaining herself. 60-year-old male, myocardial infarction mid-morning. Surgery took 8 hours. Rachel folded her hands on the table, watching her carefully. "Did he make it?" Stephanie nodded slowly, chewing. "He'll walk his granddaughter down the aisle next month." Rachel didn't need cards to know what that meant to her. "That's real magic," she said softly. Stephanie's eyes lifted to hers, and for once they weren't guarded. "I didn't call you," she said, voice low. "I thought about it. After the reading, I kept thinking about what you said, but I didn't know what to say." Rachel offered a shrug that hid 100 small disappointments. "You just did." They sat in silence, the kind that felt more like a question than an absence of words. Finally, Stephanie stood and motioned for Rachel to follow. "Come on," she said. "I want to show you something." The cardiac wing was colder, quieter. There was a reverence in the air, a holy stillness interrupted only by the rhythmic beeping of machines that reminded everyone just how thin the line between life and loss truly was. Stephanie moved through the space like a soldier in sacred ground. She touched monitors like relics, adjusted IV lines like prayers. But her voice changed, softened, deepened. She pointed at a digital EKG screen and said, "This is where we monitor electrical impulses from the heart. Every beat, every skipped rhythm, every warning." Rachel watched the lines pulse across the screen, so different from her tarot spreads but just as alive. "Like stories," she whispered, "each rise and fall telling a different truth." Stephanie glanced at her, something unreadable in her expression. "I never thought of it that way." "You read hearts one way," Rachel said, her voice gaining weight. "I read them another, same instrument, different language." They paused beside a room where a young man lay unconscious, tubes and wires draped across his chest. Stephanie didn't speak for a moment. Her shoulders tightened. 17, motorcycle crash, one more stitch, one more second delay, and we would have lost him. Rachel reached out, placing a hand gently on Stephanie's forearm. "You carry all of them, don't you?" Stephanie didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. That night, Rachel sat cross-legged on her couch, a cup of tea growing cold beside her when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Rachel, it's Stephanie." Rachel smiled instinctively. "I was hoping it would be you." "I hope it's not too late. I wanted to talk." And they did, for hours, about everything and nothing. Stephanie talked about the loneliness of precision, of a life spent mastering control, of the terror of vulnerability when all you've been trained to do is shut it down. Rachel listened and offered pieces of herself in return, stories of her grandmother's cottage in Louisiana, of the nights spent learning that sometimes your gut knew things your brain couldn't yet translate. They laughed at how absurd it was, a heart surgeon and a fortune teller, and yet the laughter wasn't dismissive. It was hope clothed in irony. As the sky shifted from velvet to pale blue, Stephanie grew quiet. "That lover's card," she said finally. "It's been on my mind. You really think it was about me?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "I don't think I know." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with a truth neither of them wanted to disturb. And when Stephanie whispered, "I think I believe you," Rachel knew something had cracked open in both of them. Not fully, not yet, but the ground had shifted. And there was no turning back now. The warning in the cards, and the night that changed everything. The morning air held a weight that felt almost unnatural, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened with something unsaid. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she turned over her tarot deck on the velvet cloth at her small shop, her eyes searching the patterns like a pianist searching for the wrong note in a beloved song. She hadn't slept much. Her dreams were filled with fire and glass and pain that wasn't hers, but sat inside her chest like a stone. She'd woken up 3 times in the night, each time reaching for her deck, hoping the energy would shift, hoping the cards would change their message. But they didn't. She drew the tower, collapse, sudden and brutal transformation, then death. Not literal, not always, but something ending, something fundamental. Then the 10 of Swords, a figure lying flat, 10 blades piercing its back, betrayal, suffering, complete devastation. 3 times, back to back, she drew the same sequence. And each time her heart screamed one name, Stephanie. Rachel tried to shake it off, to tell herself she was being paranoid. Coincidences happened. Patterns repeated. She wasn't supposed to interfere. But the longer she stared at the cards, the louder the message became, until it roared through her bones with a thunder that made it impossible to sit still. She grabbed her phone, heart thudding in her chest like it was trying to claw its way out, and dialed Stephanie's number. It rang 3 times before the clipped, professional tone of her voice answered. "I'm in surgery, Rachel. Complex valve replacement. I can't talk." "Please," Rachel whispered, not even caring if she sounded desperate. "The cards, they're showing something. A warning, please be careful today." There was a long pause. On the other end, she heard the sounds of a surgical room, metal trays, distant voices, the controlled chaos of a life suspended between science and miracle. "I can't base medical decisions on tarot readings," Stephanie said finally. And then the line went dead. Rachel sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, the weight of helplessness washing over her in cold waves. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to run to the hospital and drag her out of the OR. But instead, she just sat there, staring at the cards like they were the last sentence of a book she wasn't ready to finish. 2 hours later, Rachel heard the sound that would change everything. A thud. Sharp, sudden, close. She rushed out of her apartment above her shop, barefoot, barely registering the sting of the concrete on her soles, and saw her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, collapsed in the middle of her garden, one hand clutched to her chest, the other reaching up toward the sky as if pleading with it for mercy. Her face had gone pale, and her lips were beginning to turn a shade of blue that made Rachel's stomach turn. "Mrs. Chen," Rachel dropped to her knees, cradling the woman's head, grabbing her phone with shaking fingers as she dialed 911. "Please stay with me. Just hold on. Help is coming." The minutes stretched like lifetimes. Rachel whispered reassurances, prayers, half-remembered poems her grandmother used to chant when someone was slipping. When the ambulance arrived, she rode with them, gripping Mrs. Chen's hand, refusing to let go. At the ER entrance of Fort Worth General, the world exploded into motion. Paramedics yelled vitals. Nurses pushed through gurneys. And then, like fate had been waiting for this moment to pull its next card, Stephanie Perry appeared at the end of the hallway, still in her surgical scrubs, blood on her collar, sweat on her brow, eyes sharp and unblinking. "What's her status?" Stephanie demanded, taking command of the room like a storm-given flesh. "Massive myocardial infarction, BP unstable, declining fast," said the attending resident. "We need to prep for emergency bypass. Page OR, get blood ready." She moved like lightning, her hands steady even as the world tilted. Rachel stood in the chaos, invisible, forgotten, and yet somehow Stephanie's eyes found her. In the middle of the madness, they locked gazes for a single breath. Stephanie gave a small nod. Wait in the family room, I'll find you. 4 hours later, Rachel sat curled in one of the hospital's hard plastic chairs, her tarot deck unopened beside her. Her hands were clenched in her lap, nails digging into her skin. Every second stretched like thread pulled taut. She barely registered the nurses passing, the codes being called, the ticking of the ancient wall clock above her. And then, finally, Stephanie appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted, not tired, but emptied out. Her shoulders slumped, her hair sticking to her forehead, her eyes red with strain. And yet behind all of that was something else. Triumph. She's stable, Stephanie said. Triple bypass, long procedure, but she's going to be okay. Rachel didn't wait. She surged forward and wrapped her arms around Stephanie, burying her face into her shoulder, uncaring of the blood, the sweat, the smell of antiseptic. Stephanie froze for a second, then melted into the embrace, holding Rachel as if she too had been holding her breath for hours. The cards were right, Rachel whispered into the curve of her neck. There was no smugness in her voice, no triumph, just grief and gratitude and something aching. Maybe they were, Stephanie said quietly. Later that evening, Rachel made dinner in her apartment. Nothing fancy, just grilled vegetables, warm rice, and her grandmother's lentil stew. She needed the grounding of routine, of stirring something on the stove while the world outside spun without her consent. She didn't expect Stephanie to show up. But when the doorbell rang, she opened it to find the surgeon standing there, changed into jeans and a gray t-shirt, a bottle of red wine in one hand and a small bouquet of tulips in the other. I wasn't sure what kind of flowers tarot readers liked, Stephanie said awkwardly. Rachel took them with a smile that held too much emotion, the kind you bring with your heart in your hand. They sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath them, eating slowly, drinking more. The room felt smaller somehow, not in a suffocating way, but in a way that said, something was happening here, something that neither of them could name. I've been thinking, Stephanie said finally, setting her wine glass down. About what you said, about how I carry everyone's pain, you were right. Rachel reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together. You don't have to carry it alone. Stephanie exhaled slowly, eyes shining with a truth she didn't know how to speak. I don't know how to let go. Every time I lose a patient, I feel like I've failed them. Every success just feels like a temporary reprieve before the next disaster. Rachel touched her face gently. That's not failure, that's being human. Stephanie looked at her, something breaking loose in her chest. When's the last time someone took care of me? She repeated Rachel's question from days ago. Medical school, maybe. My residency mentor told me emotion was weakness. Your mentor was wrong, Rachel whispered. Their faces were close now, so close that breath became a language. The tension that had built between them, the glances, the late-night calls, the scones, the hospital, it all hung between them like a held note in a symphony waiting to resolve. I don't usually do this, Stephanie said, voice shaking. Neither do I, Rachel replied. And then their lips met. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't explosions. It was the quiet kind of intimacy that felt like arriving home after years of wandering. A kiss that spoke of hunger, yes, but also of gentleness, of wonder, of the discovery that two broken things could find wholeness in one another. When they finally pulled apart, Stephanie rested her forehead against Rachel's. The cards didn't predict this, she whispered. Rachel smiled, eyes closed. Some things are too powerful for divination. Stephanie laughed, a sound Rachel hadn't yet heard, real laughter, unguarded and free. A surgeon and a fortune teller. My colleagues would lose their minds. Rachel grinned. Good thing I stopped caring what people think a long time ago. Stephanie's voice softened. Another reason I think I'm falling for you. The words fell between them like the final card, in a spread that made everything else make sense. Rachel kissed her again, this time slower, deeper, tasting everything, the grief, the hope, the science, the magic. And when Stephanie stayed that night, curled up beside her on the couch until the sun crept through the blinds, neither of them said the words they both already felt. Because now the cards had been dealt, and both their hearts had chosen to play. Conferences, crystals, and conversations that changed everything. It was 2 weeks after that night, the night when everything that had once been unspoken between them was finally breathed aloud in the quiet spaces between lips and confessions, when Stephanie brought it up. She didn't say it dramatically, didn't build to it like some grand romantic gesture, but instead dropped it casually over eggs and toast in her kitchen, the way some people might mention a business meeting or an oil change. Rachel was wearing one of Stephanie's old hoodies, her legs curled under her on a bar stool, sipping coffee with honey while flipping through a vintage astrology almanac. "There's a cardiac conference in Dallas this weekend," Stephanie said, setting her coffee down without looking at her. 3 days, panels, workshops, lots of people from the top of the field. She paused. "I want you to come with me." Rachel blinked, surprised, setting her mug down slowly. "Me, at a heart surgery conference." Stephanie finally looked at her, and there was a flicker of something nervous in her eyes, rare, vulnerable. "Just pretend to be my research assistant. No one will question it." Rachel smiled slowly. "You want to take your tarot reading, chakra-lined girlfriend into a room full of Ivy League-trained cardiologists and pretend I belong." "I'm not pretending," Stephanie said quietly. "You do belong, you make me better, I want you there." So on Friday morning, Rachel found herself standing in the mirror of a downtown Dallas hotel suite, wearing a navy blazer over a modest cream blouse and fitted slacks, probably the most structured outfit she had worn in months. Her hair was tamed into soft waves, her jewelry minimal, and she wore only the lightest hint of her usual incense. She felt like she was trying on someone else's life. But when Stephanie appeared behind her, adjusting the collar of Rachel's blazer with a practiced touch and whispering, "You look incredible," all of Rachel's nerves melted into a warmth that anchored her in place. The conference buzzed with the intensity of minds colliding. Doctors from across the country clustered in groups, discussing data points and surgical innovations with the kind of passion Rachel usually only saw in artists or mystics. Stephanie moved among them with practiced grace, her confidence magnetic. She gave presentations, answered questions with fluid precision, debated with elegance. And every time she looked across the room and found Rachel, a small smile touched her lips, like a secret being shared across a crowd. During a lunch break, a tall man in his 50s approached them. Silver-haired, polished, with a Rolex on his wrist and an air of authority that suggested he was used to being the smartest person in the room. "Dr. Perry," he said, extending his hand. "I was impressed with your session on minimally invasive valve replacements. Your data on post-operative outcomes was remarkable." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison," Stephanie said graciously, shaking his hand. "This is Rachel Turner, my research coordinator." Rachel smiled, offering a polite nod. "Pleasure to meet you." Dr. Morrison gave her a quick once-over, professional, dismissive, and returned his attention to Stephanie. "Your work is pushing the boundaries of the field. We'll be watching it closely." Rachel said nothing, but inside she felt something rise. Not jealousy, not quite, but a recognition. She would never belong in this world in the way Stephanie did. But still, Stephanie had chosen her, had brought her into it. That night back at the hotel room, Stephanie collapsed onto the bed in a heap of exhaustion. "I love my field, but these conferences drain me," she mumbled into the pillow. Rachel sat beside her and brushed the hair from her face. "You were incredible today. Watching you debate catheterization techniques with a room full of know-it-alls was like watching a symphony conductor at work." Stephanie laughed and rolled onto her back. "Only you would romanticize heart surgery." "Only you would make me fall in love with the scientific method," Rachel teased, bending down to kiss her gently. The next morning, they skipped the opening keynote and instead drove an hour back to Fort Worth, where Rachel's metaphysical shop awaited a long-overdue reorganization. Stephanie wore jeans and a t-shirt, her surgical precision redirected toward labeling candles and alphabetizing essential oils. She was methodical but curious, asking thoughtful questions as she worked beside Rachel, fascinated by the crystals, the handmade incense, the dream journals filled with scrawled notes. At one point, she picked up a polished amethyst cluster. "What's this one for again?" "Healing and clarity," Rachel said, dusting a shelf. "It's also supposed to protect against negative energy. Some people sleep with it under their pillow." Stephanie turned it in her hands thoughtfully. "And people really believe this works." Rachel looked at her, smiling. "People buy hope, Stephanie. Same reason they trust you to cut open their chests and put them back together. Because you believe in something bigger than fear." Stephanie stared at the crystal for a long moment, then set it gently back on the shelf. "You're more business savvy than I gave you credit for." Surprised. Impressed, she admitted. They spent the rest of the afternoon shoulder to shoulder, cataloging items, reorganizing the front display, and pausing often for laughter and small touches that meant more than either of them said aloud. By sunset, the shop felt reborn, and so did something between them. That evening, they curled up on Rachel's couch with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of white wine. The topic turned inevitably to the past. "Tell me about your first relationship," Rachel asked, poking at her low mane. Stephanie sighed, leaning her head against the couch. "Medical school. Her name was Sarah, another resident. We dated for 6 months. She ended it when she realized I was married to my career. She wasn't wrong. And since then, a few dates here and there, nothing serious. I couldn't afford serious. Surgery demands everything." Rachel reached for her hand across the couch. "What about now?" Stephanie squeezed her fingers. "Now I'm sitting on a fortune teller's couch, eating noodles, and wondering how you managed to rearrange my entire world in 6 weeks." Rachel smiled, heart-pounding. "Want to know a secret?" "Always. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Not like this. Not this fast, not this deep." Stephanie stood, pulling Rachel up with her. "Rachel," she said softly, "I know we're different. I know your world is stars and intuition and mine is data and steel, but when I'm with you, those differences feel like music, like harmony, not noise." Rachel kissed her then, not because she was swept up in the moment, but because in that moment everything aligned, logic and magic, science and soul, her past and her future. They stumbled toward the bedroom in a haze of laughter and want, clothes shed like doubt, touch after touch speaking a language both ancient and new. And later, as they lay tangled in soft sheets, Stephanie's hand tracing shapes on Rachel's back, she whispered, "The cards didn't predict this." Rachel turned her head, breathless. "Some magic doesn't need to be read, it just needs to be lived." Stephanie smiled, kissed her temple, and held her close. The next morning brought coffee in bed, lazy kisses, and plans for dinner. As Stephanie dressed for the hospital, she paused at the door, glancing back at Rachel wrapped in a blanket on the couch. "Dinner tonight?" she asked. "I'll cook, you bring wine." Stephanie nodded, eyes shining. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me." Rachel watched her go. Knowing the woman who had once dismissed her as a charlatan now looked at her like she was the only truth that mattered. And in that quiet, glowing morning, the lover's card didn't need to be drawn again. It had already come to life. Dreams of a family, the fire of opposition, and a world that wasn't ready. The late September sky was laced with the golden spill of a Texas sunrise, light slipping through the blinds of Stephanie's apartment like a promise neither of them had dared to make out loud. The city outside was already alive with the sound of engines and ambition, but inside the world was softer. Still, Rachel stood barefoot in Stephanie's kitchen, humming a tune her grandmother used to hum while making blackberry jam, stirring pancake batter with one hand and sipping chamomile tea with the other. She wore nothing but one of Stephanie's oversized button-downs, the sleeves rolled up, her hair still messy from sleep, and yet she looked like serenity had bloomed into a person. Stephanie leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Rachel like she was watching the first real thing she'd ever seen. For a woman who lived by scans, data, and evidence-based outcomes, she was discovering something far more terrifying than the operating table. Love. Not fleeting or poetic, but real, complicated, rooted, dangerous in the way it stripped you of everything you'd built to protect yourself. "I've been thinking," Stephanie said slowly, and the tone in her voice made Rachel stop mid-whisk. Rachel turned, brow raised. "Thinking is dangerous, especially for surgeons with God complexes." Stephanie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped forward, took the whisk from Rachel's hand, set it down gently. "About family," she said. "About what that looks like for us." Rachel blinked, stunned by the softness in the way she said us. It hung in the kitchen air like something holy. "Family," Rachel echoed, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or run. "I read this article yesterday," Stephanie continued, her voice clinical out of habit but shaky underneath. "A same-sex couple in Austin. They're fighting for the right to adopt. The court tried to disqualify them because of their lifestyle." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Because they were gay. Because they weren't traditional. 2 mothers. One owns a flower shop, the other's a nurse. They said it was unstable. Rachel felt something ancient flare in her chest. "Unstable," she repeated like a curse. Stephanie nodded, then took both of Rachel's hands in hers. I know this is early, maybe stupid, maybe reckless, but Rachel, I want a future with you. I want a home. I want, she exhaled like she was pushing out years of silent desire. I want to build something. Rachel didn't speak at first. She just let the weight of those words settle in her chest like the final piece of a puzzle she hadn't even realized she'd been assembling since the day she laid those cards on the cafe table. You want to adopt? Rachel finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to have a child someday, with you, however it happens, however long it takes, but yes, if that's what you want too. Rachel nodded slowly, her heart pounding. It terrifies me, but in the best possible way. 2 weeks later, they sat across from a sharply dressed Latina woman in a downtown Fort Worth law office. Her name was Nicole Gonzalez. Her hair was clipped back in a perfect twist, her lipstick a deep, powerful red, her tone calm and precise. Same-sex adoption in Texas is possible, Nicole said, sliding a file across the desk. But you need to be prepared. There are agencies that will refuse to work with you, judges who will look for any excuse to challenge your credibility. Rachel instinctively reached for Stephanie's hand, but Stephanie's jaw had already clenched into the same tight line Rachel had seen in the OR, the look of someone preparing for a battle. What kind of excuses? Stephanie asked. Nicole didn't sugarcoat it. Your career, the hours, the emotional burden, they'll say you're unavailable. And Rachel, she turned gently toward her, your profession will be scrutinized, fortune-telling, tarot, some judges will laugh, some will call it unfit. Rachel didn't flinch. Let them try. I specialize in these cases, Nicole said, and I don't lose, but it won't be easy. The first blow came faster than they expected. An email, a file, a name. Marcus Webb, conservative lawyer, founder of something called the Traditional Family Alliance. He had filed a preliminary objection to their application before it had even been submitted. His grounds: concern over child welfare and environmental stability. Rachel sat stunned in the living room, the printout trembling in her hands. He doesn't even know us, she whispered. He doesn't need to, Stephanie said bitterly. He just needs a headline. Nicole called an emergency meeting. This man, she said, slapping Marcus's file on the table, makes his living off targeting same-sex couples. He waits for cases like yours. Then he files petitions, paints you as morally unstable, and tries to scare the agencies into dropping you. Legally, can he stop us? Rachel asked. No, Nicole replied, but he can make it hell. Days later, the other shoe dropped. A private investigator, hired by Marcus, dug into their lives. He unearthed every detail he could twist. Rachel's shop nearly going bankrupt 5 years ago, a credit card default when her grandmother died and she couldn't afford rent, an online article calling her a spiritual fraud, Stephanie's old malpractice claim from a surgery gone wrong in Boston, a claim she had been cleared of but still haunted her in late-night doubts. He's going to spin it, Nicole warned, pacing their living room. He's going to say Rachel is financially unstable, that you're emotionally unreliable, that your relationship is too new, too fragile. Rachel sat on the couch, silent. Her hands were cold. Stephanie stood near the window, staring out like she was watching a storm she couldn't stop. This is because of me, Rachel said finally. Because I'm not respectable enough, because I read cards instead of charts. This is because of hate, Nicole snapped. Don't own it like it's yours. But Rachel couldn't let go of the shame curling in her gut. That night, Stephanie and Rachel walked in silence along the Trinity River, the city lights flickering in the ripples of the water like they were trying to hold the world together. Maybe we rushed, Rachel said softly, not looking at her. Maybe we were naive. Stephanie stopped walking. Are you having second thoughts? Not about us, Rachel whispered. About the timing, about bringing a child into this when the world still wants us to disappear. Stephanie turned to face her. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with conviction. Rachel, I've spent my whole life planning every move, calculating every risk. And for once, I don't want a plan, I just want to live, even if it means fighting for something that should already be ours. Rachel looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You really think we can win? I don't know, Stephanie said. But I know I won't let anyone tell me who I'm allowed to build a life with, or what kind of mother you'd be. You taught me that some truths don't need evidence, they just need to be believed. Rachel stepped into her arms, pressing her face into her chest. The river moved beside them, endless, reflecting the city that didn't yet see them. But in that moment, they didn't need the city's permission. They had already chosen each other. And now they would choose to fight. Together, the courtroom, the collapse, and the moment she said, "I see you." The courthouse smelled like waxed floors, old paper, and the kind of bureaucracy that hardened people who once believed in justice. Rachel sat stiffly in a tailored gray dress that didn't feel like her grandmother's silver moon pendant tucked beneath the neckline, pulsing against her skin like a reminder of who she was. Beside her, Stephanie wore a sleek black blazer, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked like a shield. But Rachel could feel the tremor in her fingers, the one she hid so well behind surgical gloves and technical brilliance. This wasn't the operating table. This was far messier. This was the battlefield of perception. Nicole Gonzalez stood in front of them like a warrior priestess, her heels tapping rhythmically against the marble floor as she prepared her statement. She had warned them this would be brutal, and yet nothing prepared them for the way Marcus Webb strutted into the room like he owned truth. His suit was custom-tailored, his eyes cold with self-righteousness. He didn't look at them, not once. He didn't need to. His power was in pretending they didn't exist. The judge, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of someone who had long since lost faith in subtlety, called the hearing to order. And within the first 10 minutes, the strategy was clear. "Let the record reflect," Marcus began, his voice smooth, "that the petitioners are not legally married, have cohabitated for less than 1 year, and possess no children from prior partnerships. One is a full-time surgeon with an unpredictable schedule and a history of professional complaints. The other operates a business based on the occult." Rachel stared at the wood grain of the table, her knuckles white against her lap. Stephanie leaned forward as if she might stand up and object herself, but Nicole placed a calm hand on her arm. "We're not here to argue their love," Marcus continued, flipping through documents like a magician revealing a trick. "We're here to determine the fitness of a home environment. This is not about discrimination, it is about common sense." He laid out the so-called evidence with venom laced in civility. Rachel's prior financial difficulties, her lack of a formal degree, the Yelp reviews that questioned the legitimacy of her tarot readings, Stephanie's malpractice lawsuit even though it had been dismissed, her on-call hours, the emotional toll of cardiac surgery. The insinuation was clear, unstable, unfit, unworthy. Nicole's rebuttal was precise, powerful. She emphasized their clean criminal records, their steady finances, their references from clients, colleagues, and neighbors, including Mrs. Chen, who had recovered and submitted a handwritten statement describing Rachel as the reason she was still alive. But Marcus wasn't after facts. He was after impressions, and impressions, Rachel realized, had never favored women like her. During a break in proceedings, Stephanie found her in the hallway outside the courtroom. The sterile lighting cast shadows under her eyes, and for a moment she looked so tired it broke something in Rachel's chest. "I thought I was ready for this," Stephanie murmured. "I thought if I presented enough data, enough truth, they'd see it." Rachel touched her arm, guiding her to a bench. "Stephanie, they don't want truth. They want a story that fits what they already believe." Stephanie dropped her head into her hands. "I can rebuild a heart, Rachel, but I can't rebuild a world that doesn't want to see us." Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out her tarot deck. Stephanie looked up, confused. "You're doing a reading now." Rachel didn't shuffle. She just pulled one card from the center and turned it over. "Justice." The scales, the sword, the blindfold. Stephanie stared. "You planted that." Rachel shook her head. "I didn't, you know I didn't." They sat in silence, watching the card shimmer faintly in the light. That night back at their apartment, something cracked wide open. Stephanie paced for nearly an hour, unable to sit. Rachel lit every candle she owned, laid out calming herbs, tried to create sanctuary in a place that now felt invaded. "I don't know if I can do this," Stephanie whispered finally. "I don't know if I'm built for this kind of fight." Rachel stepped into her space slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. "You don't have to be built for it," she said gently. "You just have to stand beside me, even when it's ugly." Stephanie looked at her then, eyes shimmering. "What if they win, Rachel? What if they destroy everything we've built before we even begin?" Rachel placed both hands on her cheeks. "Then we rebuild, again and again, because what we have is worth that." Stephanie's breath hitched. "Even if we never get the child, even if they tell us no." Rachel nodded. Even then, because I didn't fall in love with the dream, I fell in love with the woman who dared to dream it. And Stephanie, strong, brilliant Stephanie, who had held hearts in her hands, who had fought death in silent hallways, broke. She collapsed into Rachel's arms, shaking with silent sobs she had kept buried beneath confidence and clinical detachment. Rachel held her for what felt like eternity, whispering nothing but her name. The next morning, something shifted. Nicole called, her voice unusually breathless. "You're not going to believe this, but Marcus made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" Stephanie asked, speakerphone crackling on the kitchen counter. "He sent a demand letter to the wrong firm. A draft meant for another client. It included language, explicit language about suppressing same-sex applications. I filed it with the judge already. It could swing the bias argument." Rachel looked at Stephanie, stunned. "It could." "It might." The next week they returned to court, and this time the energy had changed. The judge's questions were sharper. Nicole's cross-examination of Marcus was relentless. The letter became a turning point, an undeniable piece of evidence that showed this was never about the child. It was about the parents. And then something happened no one expected. The judge, known for his sternness and resistance to emotion, asked a question that wasn't in the file. "Ms. Turner," he said, addressing Rachel directly for the first time, "do you truly believe you can raise a child in a stable home, given your profession?" Rachel stood, heart hammering. "I don't sell the future, Your Honor. I help people see possibility. I've walked people through grief, loss, uncertainty. I've helped them find hope when everything looked dark. That's what I'd bring to a child, not magic, not prediction, just presence." The courtroom held its breath. Then he turned to Stephanie. "And you, Dr. Perry, what would you say to someone who argues your job makes you unavailable to be a parent?" Stephanie stood slowly, her hands calm at her sides. "I work long hours, I face life and death every day, and that makes me painfully aware of how precious time is. I know how to prioritize, I know what love costs, and I know what it's worth. I can't promise I'll never be tired, but I can promise I'll always show up. For that child, for Rachel, every single day." The judge leaned back, scribbled something, and adjourned the hearing. That night, Rachel sat on the balcony, watching the city lights blur through the lens of exhaustion. Stephanie stepped behind her, wrapped her arms around her waist, and rested her chin on her shoulder. "You were amazing today," she whispered. "So were you." "We might actually do this," Stephanie said, voice soft. "We might actually win." Rachel reached for her hand, lacing their fingers. "Even if we don't, we already won something." Stephanie leaned in, kissed her neck. "What's that?" Rachel turned to face her, their foreheads touching. "You us this." Stephanie's voice cracked as she whispered, "I see you." And Rachel, who had spent her whole life reading other people's futures, finally saw her own. The verdict, the vow, and the future the cards never saw coming. The courthouse waiting room was too quiet for a room full of lives hanging in the balance. The ticking clock above the judge's chambers sounded louder than it should have, like a metronome marking the last seconds of who they used to be. Rachel sat on the wooden bench beside Stephanie, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap they turned white. She didn't fidget, didn't speak. Her tarot deck sat zipped in her bag, untouched. For once, she didn't want to know what the cards had to say. She wanted to find out the way everyone else did, with hope, with fear, with her heart unguarded. Stephanie stared ahead, her eyes blank, her entire posture stiff and controlled. Her arms were crossed, her jaw was clenched. But Rachel, after all these months, knew how to read her in ways no one else could. She knew the pressure in her shoulders was from a night without sleep. She knew the breath Stephanie kept holding was fear dressed as composure. And she knew, because she felt the same thing, that both of them had never wanted something this much and been so helpless in the wanting. The door finally creaked open and Nicole Gonzalez stepped out. Her expression was unreadable, a poker face carved from 1,000 courtroom battles. Rachel stood on instinct, heart thudding. "Well?" Stephanie asked, her voice low but sharp. Nicole exhaled slowly, then smiled, just a little, but enough. "The judge ruled in our favor." Rachel's knees gave out for just a moment, but Stephanie caught her by the waist, holding her steady. They didn't jump, didn't cry out, didn't throw their arms around each other the way people did in movies. Instead, they stood there, forehead to forehead, eyes closed, hearts thudding in shared rhythm, letting the relief settle into their bones like something sacred. "He cited discrimination," Nicole continued. "Said Marcus's actions clearly showed bias, And more importantly, he said your testimony, both of you, made it clear what kind of home you decreate. Rachel finally found her voice. We get to start the process. Nicole nodded. As soon as you're ready. Outside, the Texas sun burned bright, casting everything in golden clarity. They walked hand in hand through the courthouse doors as if stepping into a new life. They didn't talk much during the drive. Stephanie kept one hand on the wheel, the other gripping Rachel's fingers. At a red light, she looked over and whispered, "We did it." Rachel turned, brushed a kiss against her knuckles. "No, we're just beginning." Later that week, Rachel reopened her shop. For the first time in weeks, the curtains were drawn back fully. Sunlight poured across the crystal displays, the bundles of dried herbs, the tarot decks stacked neatly beside velvet cloth. The air smelled of fresh lavender and sandalwood. Stephanie helped carry boxes in from the back, candles, new inventory, a few framed photos of them together that Rachel had finally decided to place behind the register. There was one new piece in the shop that hadn't been there before. An empty wooden cradle, positioned near the back corner beside the reading table. It was hand-carved, its curves elegant, its presence quiet but undeniable. Stephanie stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "That's new." Rachel smirked. "Symbolism is important. You don't even have a child yet." Rachel stepped beside her. "Not yet, but energy creates reality. The cradle is an invitation." Stephanie took her hand. "To the universe. To the soul that's coming," Rachel said softly. "Wherever they are, whoever they are, they'll feel it, that we're ready." Stephanie didn't answer, she just kissed her. Weeks passed in a blur of meetings, forms, interviews, and planning. Every agency worker who walked into their lives was greeted with warmth, organization, and honesty. Rachel met their scrutiny with calm certainty. Stephanie met it with data. Together, they created a balance that no one could question. They were still nervous, still scared, but now there was forward motion, momentum. Then came the unexpected email. A placement option. A child. 4 years old. A girl. Parental rights had been terminated. No immediate relatives, sweet-tempered, sensitive to loud noises, loved animals and music. Her name was Leela. Rachel read the profile 3 times, her hands trembling. Stephanie read it once, set the paper down, and whispered, "She's ours." The adoption agency arranged for a supervised visit at a local center. Rachel wore her grandmother's moon pendant. Stephanie brought a small stethoscope with a pink ribbon tied to it. They were both terrified. When Leela walked in, tiny, brown-haired, quiet as a breath, Rachel's heart nearly stopped. She knelt slowly, held out a plush bunny, and whispered, "Hi, Leela, I'm Rachel. This is Stephanie. We're really happy to meet you." Leela didn't run, didn't cry. She just walked slowly to the bunny, took it, and held it to her chest. Then she looked up and smiled. It was small, but it was everything. 3 weeks later, the judge signed the papers. Stephanie carried Leela into the courthouse in her arms. Rachel carried a bouquet of daisies. And the 3 of them walked out as a family. No applause, no crowd. Just 3 hearts beating in time. That night back in the apartment, Leela curled up on the couch beside Rachel, coloring in silence, while Stephanie unpacked a new bookshelf filled with children's books. The room was dimly lit, soft music playing, the scent of dinner still hanging in the air. Rachel glanced at the cradle in the corner of the shop that morning and thought, "We made space." And she came. Later, when Leela had fallen asleep between them on the couch, her small fingers tangled in Rachel's sweater, Stephanie looked over with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I used to think love was measured in proof, in evidence, in certainty." Rachel touched her face, smiling, and now I know it's faith, it's showing up, it's staying. Rachel leaned in and kissed her, not for show, not for passion, but for everything they had built with raw hands and worn hearts. Stephanie rested her forehead against hers. "You showed me what my hands could do outside of surgery." "And you showed me," Rachel whispered, "what magic looks like when it's real." Outside, the city slept. Inside, a fortune teller, a surgeon, and a little girl who had once been lost in the system shared the kind of peace the world rarely makes space for. And for once, no cards were drawn, because the future was already here. And it was beautiful.